So for those who have not heard the term Common Core standards, why were they considered necessary? Why the change?
California was really one of the at the forefront of the standards movement nationally. Our last standards were an advancement in how we thought about what students knew and are able to do. The Common Core state standards really took that to the next level. They are standards that were developed by many states. They are internationally benched. They are focused on college and career readiness, and really some of the best minds in English language arts and mathematics came together to put these standards together. So they really are the next logical step in a standards movement and offer really good opportunities for children to think differently and to experience different kinds of instruction and skills in their classrooms.
Well, given what you've just now said, all of the advantages in terms of college and career and getting children to think, there is a lot of opposition to them.
Yes.
And what's the opposition based on?
Well, there are a lot there is a lot of opposition to the Common Core standards, but really we find that they offer many benefits to students. They are, they really just structure. Some of the thought is that they tell teachers how they need to teach, and that really isn't the case. They tell us what our students should know and be able to do, but those decisions about the materials that we use, about the instructional methods that we use, those are local decisions made by local schools in our state and across the country for those states that are participating in the Common Core. So it really, we find that it really changes our way of thinking about teaching and learning with students. And the assessments are, of course, very closely tied to that. And all of those are really a hopeful sign for our educational system. Deeper ways of students thinking and synthesizing knowledge and bringing together the kinds of things that they know and are able to do.
Now, you said that some of the decisions will be made locally and other decisions nationally, but the core of the training, the core of the teaching, is the same nationally.
So the standards that we're trying to get our students to reach are the same nationally for those states that are participating in the Common Core. But the ways that teachers teach those, the kinds of instructional strategies and techniques that they use, the way that they, what materials they bring in to introduce, for example, in English language arts, ways for students to be able to analyze a text and to think critically about what's there and to choose a position and learn how to defend it from the text that's there. Those kinds of things, the strategies our teachers use really are ones that are developed locally and that are a matter of really the interaction between the teacher and students as it should be.
So as I listen to you talk about looking at, let's say, a paragraph and understanding what it's all about, I think that's what I was taught in school. Wasn't that what you were taught in school? So what's different about all of this?
What's different about them is really how we've structured the learning experience. Our previous standards, while they were good for their time, really you couldn't vertically align. So that means you couldn't really track a student from 3rd grade to 4th grade and see that there was a clear progression. These standards are built on just that, what are called learning progressions. So it takes a standard really from transitional kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade, and how does that standard progress over the grades? So
if there was a certain amount of work you had to do in, let's say, 2nd grade, that would prepare you for 3rd grade. Supposedly that would prepare you for 4th grade. So wasn't that a natural progression from kindergarten to 12th grade?
It was, but this is a much more kind of sequential progression. In mathematics, for example, it brings in what are called the mathematical practice standards. And so there are skills that develop across different spans of grades that really intentionally and that bring in some of the kind of habits of mind that students need to develop as well. So it's a much more cohesive and intentional way of thinking about what students know and can do.
When you talk about habits of mind, can you give an example?
The one we were speaking about a few minutes ago, how to read and analyze a text rather than just being able to repeat some facts back that about what happened in a story, but really how to delve deeply and analyze what an author is trying to do with a character, or what the subtext of a story is, or some of those sorts of deeper ways of thinking about reading and language arts.
So you're saying there's less learning by rote now?
I would say so. We had, in our former assessments received a lot of criticism because they were multiple choice fill in the blank. And what we learned is when you attach high stakes to an assessment, instruction tends to gravitate toward that because we all want our children to perform well. So when that was multiple choice, fill in the blank, that had an impact on instruction. When we're looking at assessments that are more performance-based, that are deeper ways of knowing, that involve kind of authentic experiences with children, that also has a draw on instruction, and we think it's a positive one for children.
So you're saying now teachers can't teach to the test? Because I think before in the classroom, the teacher knew what was going to be on the test and could give the students materials that corresponded to the test.
That's right. That did happen sometimes. These are much more, the level of rigor in these assessments is much higher. There are some multiple choice sections, but these are also computer adaptive tests. So where students before took paper and pencil tests, these are on the computer, and they're adaptive, meaning that if I answer one question incorrectly, the next question might be a little bit easier, so it could really hone in on what I can do. And the reverse is true. If I'm answering questions correctly, it'll raise the level, so it really can, we're not just looking at whether a student can pass a proficiency cut mark, but really what do we know and are able to do. So that's one of the exciting things about the tests.
It makes me wonder when you talk about students beginning to think deeper. There is a lot of inequality within the school systems. So how is this set up so that those who have less in less affluent communities can still achieve and compete with those in more affluent communities?
Well, I think the exciting thing is that these tests really are about structuring our those habits of mind and preparing our children for college and career. And I mean, one of the things we know is that children, whatever communities they reside in, have incredible potential. So this is really an opportunity for us to think about what can we do as schools, as a school community, to provide the children what they need to achieve that potential. And these tests are, they will look very different from what we had before. They'll be more rigorous in many ways, and I think it really raises the bar for all of us in positive ways.
Yes, it seems when you talk about something being more rigorous, if certain students aren't passing them now and they're more rigorous, wouldn't they be more likely to be left behind?
Well, so the first time they take the test, I think it will look very different. One of the things that the computer adaptive nature of the tests that I was just talking about, where it will really hone in, it'll give us much more specific information about what children are able to do, not only in the broad categories of language arts and mathematics, but also in some more specific areas in each of those subject areas. So we'll have much more kind of actionable information. The other thing that really is a nice feature is that California purchased the digital library for every child in California. Many states, schools, or school districts had to pay for that themselves, but California supported that for all of our districts. And those materials have a couple of things in them. They have interim assessments, so schools can test children, over the course of the year and kind of assess how they're doing leading up to these assessments. but also they have a digital library of tools and resources that teachers can use in the context of instruction to really deepen instruction and learning, which is an exciting feature, because really this isn't about how you do on a testing day or days. It's about how your instruction is responsive to your needs over the course of the year, and how prepared you are really to do well and to excel in the next grade level.
You mentioned computers a lot, so these tests will all be taken on the computer.
That's right.
For children who don't have computers at home, wouldn't they be at a disadvantage?
Well, so schools have spent the last couple of years ensuring that they were ramped up and prepared to offer the assessments on the computers. The multiple choice section of them, the computer adaptive part, is on the computer. There are also performance activities that happen in the classroom that aren't. The larger question really is, and the opportunity really, with those computers now that we have, is how do we use those day to day in instruction in ways that deepen teaching and learning? Not that just replicate what we were able to do yesterday with paper and pencil, but that really give us the opportunity to do things we could never have done before, that connect us with other students and classrooms, that expand the walls of the classroom, give us access to information and materials that we couldn't have done if we were just relying on a book. So that's, I think, the opportunity.
And how does that look? Isn't that all dependent more or less on the programs that you're working with on the computer?
Well, so it can be. So it certainly is at the County Office of Education, we consider that a very important part of our professional development task, because now certainly there were schools and districts that had computers and technology. There are more that have them now. And so I think it is, as we begin to have conversations, or as we continue these conversations about what instruction needs to look like today to prepare children, not only for these assessments, but for the Common Core and for their lives beyond, it also is an opportunity to think and have conversations about what instruction looks like that uses that technology and that really leverages it on behalf of students.
So let's talk about that. What does instruction look like?
when
that leverages the technology. Yeah, so what's different? I understand now teachers won't just be standing up in front of the classroom and the students repeat what the teacher says.
Right.
So what will happen?
So we think, I think it can look very different. I think many of these classes are decentralized, so it's not just a teacher standing up and everyone listening and everyone in the classroom being on page 112 of the textbook. But it really is about differentiating instruction and personalizing instruction. So that's one of the opportunities in technology, to use data, to use not just summative data that happens at the end of the year, but formative data that really is data that a teacher can collect from what I do today that informs what they do with me tomorrow as a student.
So what does that mean when you talk about personalized instruction?
So it means that in a classroom, instead of everyone being on the same activity, that it'll be individualized. So in the ideal scenario, there's some sort of pre-assessment that says, well, so these students have already mastered that skill, so we're not going to have them spend time on that skill. We'll let them go on to the next thing. These students are struggling a little on that skill, so we'll pull them and reinforce that skill. But we don't want to one of the things we don't want to do, that is a mistake we made in our past in education, was relegating students who are struggling to that track where they had to experience that every time. Technology gives us the opportunity to let students move flexibly in and out and have instruction that really is about what they currently know and are able to do, and keeps pushing them. We'd like to talk of it as at the instructional level is somewhere between mastery, where I can already do this, it's not a challenge, and frustration, where this is so hard that I'm just gonna, I can't try. So somewhere in the middle of that, I'm able to be successful, but it's also a push for me, and that's what.
And the goal is at the end of the school year that, regardless of where a student started in the beginning of that year with the personalized instruction, it's hoped that everybody will end up having mastered a certain prescribed set of information.
That's true.
certain
and,
skills.
Well, and so
If it's a progression, so that they're ready for the next grade, the
that's
next
right.
step.
Well, and one of the opportunities with these assessments, and we'll be watching the reauthorization of ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, at the federal level, because one of the conversations we have a lot is not just assessing students in terms of a proficiency cut score. So we don't want to just know if you're able to cross over that score, because then let's say the score is here and you went from here to here, you still weren't there, but you made a lot of growth, and maybe you're here and you went down, and we don't know that. But if we're able to look at how much growth we would expect a student to show in a year, and bench it on that, then that gives us a lot more information about how successful we're being with that child.
So what about that grade? Will the grading system still be the same? Because if the student moved from here to here and should be here, and the student who was here fell down, what does that do in terms of the grades?
Well, you know, a lot of that part was still being developed, but I think what we would like to move toward is saying how much growth would we expect a student to make in a year, and then bench their progress on whether they met or exceeded that mark or didn't quite make that, rather than whether they hit some arbitrary cut score.
So that student will get an A on the basis of how much progress they made, as well as the student who hit the mark.
Well, so that would be an individual teacher and school decision, those kinds of grading practices. The Common Core and Smarter Balanced assessments don't dictate local grading, but it's always been in schools a combination of how students perform on their assessments, which give us some kind of objective measure, as well as their teachers' experience with them. And none of this replaces that deep interaction between teachers and children. And that's the same thing is true for the technology we were talking about. The technology that really matters and is impactful is technology that deepens that interaction between teacher and child, that doesn't try to replace it.
So much is dependent on the computers. What oversight is there in terms of the operation of the computers themselves?
Well, so I think one of our opportunities now is to think about how those computers are used, to ensure that schools have in terms of the bandwidth and the infrastructure that they need for students, not just all to be able to take the test on the same day, but for classrooms really to be places where there are many devices that are operating, and teachers are able to work with students on accessing those devices and using that.
So in a classroom, for example, and it's testing, all students will be tested on the same day under the same computer system? I mean, when you mentioned bandwidth, so I'm thinking, what happens if there is a computer failure or
so there's a testing,
the internet goes down?
Right. Well, so there's a testing window that schools have that they begin testing after a percentage of the year has been completed, but then they have until late May to finish these assessments, for example. So so they have these tests are different because students can come back to them, and so it doesn't all necessarily in fact it doesn't all happen in a day, because there are also some performance kinds of tasks that students do that are part of these tests, which are something really different for us in California.
Well, as we talk about what's really different, let's just talk about the process. So it's testing day. Students sign into an individual computer. They're presented a test. How are they identified by the computer?
So they have student identification numbers and that sort of thing. They would take the English Language Arts computer adaptive section, for example, and then do perhaps a classroom activity that's related to a performance assessment. Maybe it's about having conversation or some information as a group in terms of a historical period or something like that, and then the performance task would be something related to that. They do have, part of the challenge, and why it was really nice that California gave us the opportunity last year for all students to experience the field test with no scores returned. So it was in a no stakes environment, because they're also tools of the computer that they have the ability to use. For example, in math, there might be an electronic protractor or an electronic ruler that they're able to use in specific items or something like that. So
and these are, of course, tools that they've been using all along in the school.
That's where they need to be. Yes, that's why we want the technology incorporated in the daily context of instruction. So these aren't new things or new experiences for kids the first day.
But that child has done is saved in the computer. What happens if, is there a possibility that information is lost?
Well, so I think these are very robust systems, and they're operated at the national level. So of course, while anything is possible, they've done lots of redundancy testing and to ensure that the reliability.
So have students been tested under the Common Core standards?
Some have begun. They've just begun recently in the last few weeks.
Any results?
No, we don't have any results yet. We won't. Results won't be returned until after the last student or the last school in a district has completed testing, and that's a much wider window than we had before, because schools can kind of put that. There's a amount of instruction that needs to be completed first, but then they have the flexibility to decide when they're tested in that window. And so some schools, for example, if they're testing in a computer lab, might have a grade level go in and do that in the lab, and then they're doing something in the classroom, and the next day another grade level is in there or something.
So
like
when was the Common Core standards rolled out in the San Mateo County School District?
Well, so they were adopted by the state in 2010 by the State Board of Education. They had been in development for a number of years before that. So our state board adopted them in 2010, and then we had a few years where the Common Core really were the adopted standards, but we were in kind of a difficult spot because all of our instructional materials were still based on the former standards. Our assessments, the STAR tests, were still based on the last standards. So we were saying, learn these, and really it was the time that we worked with teachers and the kind of teaching force to understand these new standards, because it was a bit of a time where you were learning a new thing while still doing and being tested on the old one. So last year was the first year when we really got rid of the old assessments.
Completely?
Yes, students didn't take the old assessments
at the beginning of the year, or at the beginning of the school year?
The last school year they didn't. The last school year they didn't take the old assessments at all. They took a field test of the Smarter Balanced assessments, but didn't have scores returned last year.
Okay, so how were students promoted, or?
So it was based on their grades in their classroom, the assessments. So schools sometimes do their own assessments. A teacher might do assessments. A school or district might have identified assessments, and so it was based on those things.
Now,
standardized.
Assessments, are these based on the teacher's individual perceptions of the students, or is there something that's an objective measurement?
So most schools and districts had some sort of system that they used last year, and it was a 1 year moment of shift from the old system to the new system.
Did they all correspond?
Yes. So
I'm thinking if the individual schools could decide on their own assessments.
Oh.
Did these assessments correspond across school districts?
So schools all use a variety of measures, and multiple measures is really the best way for us to assess what students know and are able to do. So that was already happening, and the standardized assessment was one kind of data point in that universe of things that we look at for kids. So then they didn't have that statewide assessment, but it really was a plus because we really were at a point of ramping up the Common Core. It was going to be the first time students experienced these very different tests. So I think it was a big assist for our kids and for their teachers and schools that we had a year to, let's all try this new system before scores are coming back to count.
The thing about it is some might think it's a disadvantage. If there are no scores, then how can students be rated and passed on to the next grade if there are no scores?
That's right. Well, we're back this year. This is the first operational year of the test, so we'll have scores this year.
So everybody last year was just passed on?
Well, they weren't necessarily passed on, but the teacher in school made the determination based on multiple measures. As those things have always factored in how you've performed on your assessments in the classroom, and there are some kinds of mathematics assessments that many schools use that are called Mars tests. So those kinds of things people still used, and districts made decisions about how for that 1 year of transition they would assess students. And now this year, students have just begun this testing window for the first operational year. So they will have scores this year. They will certainly have meaning this year. They'll have more meaning next year because our scores, as we were discussing, we're looking at growth. So this will kind of be the benchmark year, and then the next year we would be able to see how students grew from that point.